Well, we before I get in, we currently still have offices in we closed all our offices in Russia about 4 months ago after being declared an unwanted organization and a bunch of other things. But we have offices, in Armenia, Georgia, Bosnia, and Moldova. Let's see, Sarajevo, Montenegro. In a lot of places that border.
Yeah.
And we actually have a small office in Kyiv. But let me just sort of set the scene here. I'm one of the founding directors of Project Harmony, sort of a 1984-85 organization. My background is actually I'm an architect by training.
Huh.
I graduated from Amherst College in 1960, Yale School of Architecture in 64, was on a Fulbright in Finland for a year, lecturing and working in an architectural office there. And, I have had a life of design and building, for most of my life. But in 1984, when our government, was mired in the Cold War, and there was this sort of stagnation of sort of diplomatic efforts. By accident, three of us got together. The three founders of Project Harmony were Kathy, Cadwell, David Kelley, and myself. Kathy Cadwell was a social studies teacher at a local high school. David Kelley was a lawyer in Montpelier, and I was an architect.
Uh-huh.
And we had similar feelings about the sort of stifling Cold War and punctuated by the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, and I had a daughter studying in Germany, had a boyfriend whose family lived next to the Berlin Wall. We made some trips there. So our feeling was at the time, meaning the three of us, was that if our government can't get it done, the citizen diplomacy was in a sort of fledgling state at the time, and coincidentally, our good friend Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan got together in Geneva, in 1985, and came up with some cultural agreements that.
Can I interrupt you a second? Just ask,
yeah.
Did any of the three of you had you ever been to the Soviet Union, or did you speak Russian, or any particular background in this other than the war, the threat of war?
No, although my year in Finland brought me to the the 30-day war, brought me to a lot of Finnish history, and I became quite close friends with some individuals who were exported from Finland during that time, to Sweden, and the sort of curious position of Finland during the Second World War. I really that was my only contact with Russia. I went to Estonia during my time in Finland. and sort of became acquainted with the Baltics but no, none of us have had a relative or anything. My relatives came from County Cork.
Yeah.
Kathy Cadwell and her husband. Actually, Kathy, being a social studies teacher, and just sort of incidentally, she and her husband actually went and lived in Georgia during the 90s and taught school there.
Oh, okay.
That, of course, that's after we had started the program in 1985. I mean, things just so our legacy, was not deep.
Yeah, right. So you started this with the objective of bridging differences or cultural exchanges, or what were you trying to do?
Okay, well, our original, when we first got together, myself, I'm a sort of hockey player by sport choice, and our first thought was, geez, let's take a youth hockey team to Russia. We can really make some, and we had a lot of friends, in particular at Middlebury College, but then we sat down and said, that would mean boys only at that point in history, and we said, well, that's not going to work, so we said, Russians like music, let's choose music as a medium, and hence the name, frankly. So we joined, since Kathy Cadwell was a teacher at our local regional high school called Harwood Union. We convinced the principal at that time, a recent graduate of Harvard Ed, that this would be an okay thing to do. Take the advanced chorus from the high school and build an exchange program with the Soviet Union. And there was not a lot of support from school board at the time, although the principal convinced most of them that it was an okay thing to do. So hence the name, Project Harmony. We said, geez, we're a singing group. We got 25 kids. So the messengers were teenagers. And the medium was music. And, we built this prior to actually building this first group. We went to, since Kathy Cadwell was a graduate of Middlebury College, along with her husband, we went to see Olin Robeson. You remember Olin Robeson, the president of Middlebury at the time?
No, I didn't. Yeah.
Anyways, Olin Robeson was a member. He was a Russian speaker. He wrote a lot of commentary. And the guy Ray Benson. I don't know if you know Ray Benson had just left the Moscow embassy as the cultural affairs officer, and he started the American Consortium of Colleges as a professor at Middlebury College.
Okay.
We went to see Olin Robeson, and Olin Robeson looked at us, the three of us at the time, maybe there, and said, guys, if you're going to be dealing with the Soviet Union, this will be a marathon, not a sprint. And so if you think you're just going to sort of go over there and do your thing and make some waves and so forth, you better be ready for a long haul. And we just swallowed those things. Dave Kelley and I said, we got to make some contacts here. We went to the UN.
Okay.
We went to the UN, and they had a cultural attaché there by the name of Valentin Makarov. And this guy had one office, and we just went we just went to New York, went there, knocked on his door, and said, "Come in," and and said, "What are you here for?" And we told him we'd like to take a group to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And he said, "You know, I got a 12-year-old son that's you know, he's interested in actually coming to the States. You know, maybe I can work something out with for you." And he said, "You know, there's an organization called Sputnik. Do you remember Sputnik?"
Yeah, the Youth Travel Organization.
Yeah, Youth Travel Bureau.
Right.
Intourist was the adult version.
Was the adult. I went to the Soviet Union in 1984 on an Intourist trip. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So this guy, Valentin Makarov, you know, here we were putting together this group of 25 musicians, singers from Harwood Union High School.
In what state? In Maine or Vermont?
Vermont.
Vermont, yeah.
We're in Waitsfield, Vermont, which is just south of Montpelier. And we convinced Valentin to come to Vermont. And, you know, they weren't supposed to travel at that time more than 25 miles away from the UN.
Right.
And coincidentally, we informed the Boston Globe that, well, someone said, you know, told us, the Boston Globe published this little piece after Valentin had come and met the group and so forth. And Valentin, they published this piece, and Valentin Makarov got, I don't know what you call it, got scolded, you know, for traveling.
Yeah.
On. And
right.
Anyways, he became our contact with Sputnik.
Okay.
And we kept him informed and so forth. But we put together this group, and it, you know, we ran all these seminars. You know, Ron Leibowitz. You know Ron Leibowitz? You know, that name mean anything to you? He became the president of Middlebury College, but at the time he was a professor of Russian geography and Russian, and we got Stanley Rabinowitz. Stanley Rabinowitz, professor at Amherst in Russian literature, also a professor at Harvard in the same. We got Stanley Rabinowitz to come up, and we did all these seminars, you know, to get the children, the kids in the group up to speed on some Russian history, some Russian literature, we had, you know, the nuclear accords were being negotiated at the time. We got some of those folks involved, and tried to, you know, build a group that had a little bit of background. And so forth. And so we took our first trip in November of 1985 with this choral group, and Sputnik arranged a tour of Leningrad, Smolensk, Moscow, and Minsk. And you know, that trip opened the floodgates. It opened the floodgates. We became attached to the Zhdanov Pioneer Palace in Leningrad. Was our primary host, and that was at the time a giant Pioneer Palace. I mean, with I don't know how many thousand members, but you know, and of course we were totally amazed at the, you know, at the repertoire of language training, music, dance, sports, shachmat, chess, just everything imaginable collected under one roof,
Right.
essentially. And so they became our primary contact, and the trip made such an impression on the delegation that kids, and there were 25 kids and probably 6 adults.
Yeah. With all three of you, the founders of Project Harmony, part of this?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so we told Sputnik, that they said, okay, send us another group. And we said, well, we're not going to send you another group until you send us a group.
Ah.
And when you send us the group, I know you put us all up in hotels, but when you send us a group, we're going to do homestays with your kids. And that was almost a deal breaker, because they said, well, that's you're gonna propagandize, these kids,
Right.
And so, but we promised that we'd put them at least in pairs or triples. There were enough adults in the return group that was based from the Zhdanov Pioneer Palace. So this group of 33 kids and adults were, we're not talking amateur singers here. We're talking we're talking sort of operatic trained voices. Some of them were in their 20s, some of them were definitely but we brought them to Vermont to start with, and they were in homestays, and part of the group that came, the adult part, were definitely KGB sort of adults.
Right.
Others were choral directors and musicians and so forth. But and that visit unleashed just an incredible. Well, it unleashed the FBI, for one thing.
Wow. Yeah.
My wife was principal of our elementary school, and many of the kids were in the school for observations and singing and so forth. And day after that occurs, the FBI shows up in her office saying, asking her questions about, what kind of discussions did you have, this and that. The FBI was from Albany, New York,
Yeah.
the closest one. But that visit, and of course, the final concert there was in Burlington, and Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington at the time.
Okay.
And Bernie Sanders was just sort of in love with this delegation, and I can remember Bernie at the end of Memorial Auditorium holds a couple thousand people, and Bernie gets up to sort of conclude the concert and said, folks, you've met the enemy. And at the time, I was standing next to the FBI guy in his trench coat, in the back of the
Right.
And I said to him, I said, so what do you think? And he just smiled and sort of walked away and said, I don't know what I'm doing here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Basically.
What year was that? What year was that?
That was 1986.
86. Okay.
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 So, just, uh, you know, after those two exchanges, we, in our first exchange, we encountered, school principals. We were visiting secondary schools, that taught English and German and so forth as specialties, and schools that focused on artistic uh, pursuits. And they said, could you arrange a school exchange? You're doing one with the Pioneer Palace, but how about us? And and of course, at that time, we said yes to everything. We said,
Yeah.
yeah, we said yes. Of course we could. And I don't know if you remember the Samantha Smith
Yeah.
episode.
Yes.
And that happened in '82, and with Andropov and her visit with her father to Russia, and the first monies that USIA, the United States Information Agency, put out were called the Samantha Smith grants.
Uh-huh.
And we tapped in. We immediately sort of tapped into the USIA, and began just a massive relationship with them.
Uh-huh.
And we got a Samantha Smith grant,
Uh-huh.
which funded initially what were called direct school exchanges.
Right.
And the explosion of interest, in Russian and Russian culture, and sort of the opportunity, for kind of nonprofit groups to engage that culture, just went crazy. And my son, who was a participant on our first exchange in '85, he was he went to Amherst in '86 and decided he'd major in Russian studies.
Uh-huh.
And and along with, and at the time when Ray Benson had established this American consortium of colleges, with Middlebury, Amherst, Bowdoin, Davidson, with exchanging, students for a semester as part of their Russian studies programs.
Right.
That led to a lot of interest in Russian programs.
Right. Right.
And at Amherst, well, I'm sure you've probably heard of Jane and Bill Taubman, and who wrote the big biography recently of Gorbachev, and anyways, a lot of the students actually on our first exchange became Russian studies majors.
I see.
And they
And
actually.
did your group as a group expand, or was it still just the three of you kind of managing all this?
We took on, I guess you'd call them employees, although they were, as they will remind us, they were not very highly paid.
Yeah.
And we probably had, we were still working out of my basement, and so forth. And we still had these tiny Apple computers, about as big as my iMac here, my
iPad. Yeah.
iPad, and they were all young collegians, who and some of them hadn't even graduated. They were working for summers and so forth. And but when we began to, and all of this stuff with Sputnik was non-currency exchanges, and that meant that we would send groups, and Sputnik would totally take care of them, transport them, feed them, find school partners and so forth. And we would do the same when they came to the States. And when we paired them with a school, of course, the school that we paired them with was responsible for finding host families, putting together a program. We would embed a translator in the group, and so forth. But the schools actually had to sort of raise a certain amount of money in order to host these direct school exchanges. And at one point we had nearly 100 schools. I mean, we're talking from Palo Alto, California, to Maine, to Rhode Island, to New Jersey, New York, Chappaqua, Ridgewood. I mean, all over the place.
And what year would you say that was when you had that level of interest?
Well, it certainly was by 90.
Yeah.
Because my son came to work for Project Harmony when he graduated in 1990, and he was leading these. He was living in Russia and leading these schools that we were sending over there, and moving from. So the direct school exchanges led to what were called semester study programs. And that was where, in these Russian schools, for instance, we had school partnerships in Petrozavodsk, in Pskov, in Novgorod, in Novosibirsk, in Volgograd, and all over the place. And so we began sending staff full-time to Russia. We opened an office in Moscow. Our first office manager there is someone you should interview. Paul Podolsky, came out of Brown. And we found him a school in Moscow to actually teach in to begin with. And this is in 1990, In
1990. And this is U.S. Information Agency funding allowed you to do this?
After we sort of, many of these early direct school exchanges were this non-currency, schools like, the Brooks School in Providence sent their entire junior class, and they would also fund the hosting of the group that came back, and so, but we began to get more and more money.
Yeah.
And the programs, Dan, the semester study program popped up, that became a funded program where we were recruiting our staff in Russia had grown to probably 6 or 8 people. They were traveling throughout Russia, interviewing potential Russian students who had English ability in these English language schools and determining whether they felt they could handle an American host family and a secondary school education curriculum. But in the meantime, the USAID began funding these special, so what we call sort of special focus programs. They get, like the first one, one of the first ones we did was the White Sea Ecology Program. We joined up with a pioneer palace in Murmansk, and these pioneer palaces have these zoology, ecology groups, these giant aquariums, all this stuff. And they wanted to, we designed this program to look at the ecology of the White Sea, and then we were sampling the canals in Leningrad or and then when they came to the States, we were at Arcadia National Park, looking at the littoral sort of population in the Atlantic there, and in the early 90s, we broke into the Baltics. We found this environmental studies school in Riga, and we designed this program between Vermont rivers and lakes and the rivers and lakes in Latvia. And it was amazing. We just said, okay, we're headed for Riga.
What year was that? Was that also in the 90s? In 90?
Yeah, that was probably 91.
Yeah, before the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it was before.
Yeah.
It was before. And the Latvian program led to one in Lithuania. We were rowing every lake and river and taking water samples, and we were joined up with an ecology environmental studies program at Montpelier High School in Montpelier. And in 1990, I believe, Kathy and her husband went to Tbilisi. Because we had done a folk arts program with the Pioneer Palace in Tbilisi.
Okay.
And we had taken a group of American teenagers from 3 different high schools, and who prepared a whole thing of American folk songs, American folk history of the South, the Midwest, the West.
Wow.
All this sort of American folk music history, and we took it to Georgia, and the Georgians just, if you know anything about Georgian culture, they are phenomenal dancers and singers, and
yes.
The Pioneer Palace in Tbilisi sent this delegation of Georgians for us to, and we took them all over New England and Manhattan and Spanish Harlem and from that group, Kathy Cadwell, one of the founders, and her husband Jared decided they were going to go live in Tbilisi and teach high school, teach English in the high school there. So, they did that and became embedded in Georgian culture.
And they were there at the period in which then there were all the uprisings and excess when they exited the Soviet Union, right? Were they there?
Killing people on the steps of the parliament there.
Yeah, with Gamsa Kurdia and then Shevardnadze replacing him, all those things. That was years.
Right.
Yeah.
So Kathy Cadwell sort of took this hiatus in her social studies career at the local high school, and you know, they were learning Georgian. And in fact, I texted Kathy yesterday and I said, Kathy, where are you? She says, well, I'm with our Georgian friends out in California, you know, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, so this Georgian connection became pretty intense. And today, our biggest office is in Tbilisi.
I see. I
Our
see.
biggest, in fact, we just got it's a $10 million grant here for our work in Georgia to last over 5 years. But so these special, you know, the direct school exchanges and the semester study programs, these special study programs became sort of intertwined here.
Uh-huh.
And Vermont established a sister state relationship with Karelia.
With Karelia. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
All
Okay.
these
And
cities,
Burlington has the sister city with Yaroslavl.
Yaroslavl.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, most of the cities were city to city. Vermont itself established the state to state relationship with Karelia.
And were you involved with that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and Bernie Sanders, you know, as mayor of Burlington, got very involved in the Yaroslavl piece of it. And of course, Ben and Jerry's got very involved in this Karelia state relationship because they built their factory up in Petrozavodsk.
And Petrozavodsk, yeah. Do you know anybody that was involved with that? That would be, I'd love to talk to somebody from Ben and Jerry's.
Oh my God, yeah, you know, so Karelia became one of our sort of our most intense, you know, areas of involvement. You know, we had, I don't know how many direct school exchanges there. We had a disabled children's program, which I mean, you can't even begin I can't even begin to describe, you know, what we uncovered in this program, you know, of working with the disabled community in Petrozavodsk, which had been not seen the light of day for 100 years or more.
Yeah.
We brought doctor delegations. We brought a whole group of urologists, and we're doing laparoscopy, gallbladder removals, you know, in Karelia.
Wow.
We did a whole agricultural exchange because Ben and Jerry's was buying the cream and so forth from a whole group of dairies in Karelia. So there was interest in you know, an agricultural exchange with Vermont being a dairy producer, so forth. You know, and then almost by accident, and by this time, you know, we had a real office in the town of Waitsfield where I live. You know, we bought a part of a building, or we took a mortgage on it, got out of my basement. We had, you know, 10 people in our office in Vermont. We had probably 20 people in Russia.
Around what years was this?
Probably mid 90s.
Okay, so it was after this collapse of the Soviet Union. You expanded all these exchange programs, right?
Although, you know, our staff our staff was in Kaunas, you know, when Lithuania, you know, raised their flag of independence. They were in Riga. They were, in 91,
Uh-huh.
things were just, as you remember, they were just exploding with excitement,
Right, right.
and sort of international sort of sovereignty.
Yeah, right.
But we, let's see, where was I here?
Well, you were talking about your expansion, and I just diverted you because I'm just trying to get the time sequence. And Karelia became a sister state before the Soviet Union disbanded or after?
Before.
Before. Okay. Okay.
Before.
So it was a pretty intense period of activity in those years in 88 to 91, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
God. I mean, in most, like in Petrovsk, we became attached at the hip to the children's palace there.
Okay.
And in fact, that's where Ben and Jerry's located their factory.
In Petrovsk, yeah.
In the lower portion of the children's palace.
In the children's palace itself. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And had this amazing, they were giving ice cream, one day a week, was free ice cream to all the kids, and in return for, rent and so forth. And we became very close to the manager of this guy, David Morse, who was sent over there by Ben and Jerry's to set up the factory.
Uh-huh.
And, early on, we began hiring Russian staff.
Yeah.
And renting offices, and we eventually, we bought a part of the building in Zavodsk. We bought two co-op apartments in St. Pete, renovated them. We bought an office in Moscow. I mean, this is in late 90s, but we migrated from just renting and so forth to actually purchasing and renovating. Because I was an architect, and I said, let's, I know how to do this.
Right.
And, I would hire, all these different tradesmen and so forth. But so the, once in 91, when things basically came unhinged, I mean, our euphoria was, we were beyond, it was almost out of control in terms of what we were able to do and being asked to do. And coincidentally, in 1990, was it 2 or 3? We got a call from a group in Fitchburg, Mass. Fitchburg, Medford. A couple of police officers who had sort of heard, wanted to do an exchange with the Soviet Union. Okay, a guy by the name of Paul Mikowski, and from Medford, Eddie Cronin from Fitchburg, and Wilbraham, and not Wilbraham, but Lemonster and so forth. Anyways, we put together this because in Petrovsk, we'd been working with a school director at a children's school. Her husband was either the chief of police or one of the sergeants in the police department there, and he said, Jesus, if you can do a school exchange, we can do a police exchange at least. I mean, we're more important than my wife's, school. So we began working with this group in Central Mass, in Fitchburg, Medford, and we decided that we would formulate a group that had different community policing elements to it. Drug and alcohol, rape investigations, domestic violence advocates, and so forth. And that anyone that wanted to come on this program, had to have be able to present in one of these expertise, one of these group things.
Right.
We put together a group that was like, God, I forget how big it was, like 30 people, and the chief of police organizations were funding these various participants. We had participants from the Mass State Police, from Belling, Tingsboro, just
Wow.
all over the place there. And we went with this delegation, and by the time we went, we had convinced CBS News to embed a commentator or a correspondent with us. And he was one of the sort of known guys. I sort of forget his name actually now, but so we go to Petrozavodsk with this police delegation, and loaded with, I mean, everything from armored vests to as gifts, as
Right.
to all kinds of what's called PR-24s, these batons, these of course, we actually took a drug dog with us because we had a
Wow.
drug dog there to give as a gift, to the department in Petrozavodsk, and we go there, and it's just like, it's just unbelievable, because the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is, is slightly military.
Right.
I mean, we became extremely friendly with the chief of police in Petrozavodsk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chief Yunash, his name was. Yunash was a close friend of Gorbachev, or the leading MVD guy down in Moscow. I forget it all, but and
so this was still Soviet Union times. These times. Yeah.
Union. But
right.
we organized a return trip for this Chief Yunash and his group, and by that time we had convinced, somehow the State Department got wind of this program and invited us to the State Department, and they basically said, how much money do you want, and how many exchanges do you want to do? Just tell us, just tell us how much you need.
Yeah.
And the money was like, I mean, we'd never heard of FICA, not FICA, but what's the overhead formula that we use? Anyways, we made up an overhead formula, based on some friends who had been working with big time money, and the State Department says, that sounds good, we'll just go with that. And so when we brought this delegation to the States, we were focused in Central Mass, and had, just like all these programs in Worcester and in Boston and Lowell and even in Cambridge, actually. And when we went to Washington, Louis Freeh, who was head of the FBI at that time, invited us to come and stay at the FBI Academy.
Whoa.
And be a part of what was called the National Academy, which is a, where all these police officers who were chosen by the departments every year go there for, I think, 12 weeks or something to the academy in Quantico and so forth. So here we were, with this delegation of Russian police officers from Petrozavodsk taking part in seminars at the FBI Academy in Quantico, and Louis Freeh is there talking to them and saying, and the group is, doing these mock drug raids in that village they have there. I forget what it's called. They're in their firing range, firing all the weapons. They're in their the mock video studios where you react to certain hostage situations and so forth, firing these
Right.
virtual weapons, and at the same time, this National Academy is taking place. So these high-class officers from all over the country are interacting, with these guys,
How many Russians were there in your group?
There were probably 30.
30? And I assume you must have had a bunch of translators because, cops in those days didn't speak English.
We did have some. Some. We had probably 3 cops who were detectives in the Petrozavodsk that had gone through English school and.
Oh, okay, okay, but they must have loved this, man.
It was like, they were holding seminars, hopefully running by with these guys, running by these American mafia, Russian mafia, and ask them if they knew anything about these various these Russian mafia guys operating in Brooklyn and so forth, and
right.
And of course, the police department of Petrozavodsk is sort of provincial. They didn't have much.
Yeah.
Anyways, this law enforcement program exploded into, we did this domestic violence coalition, building these coalitions in Odessa, in Lviv, in Petrozavodsk, in Volgograd, where we would go in with police delegations from, we had police coming from, from New Orleans, from Michigan, all over the place to these delegations. We put together these groups, and this domestic violence program was to go in and build these coalitions of community groups that would intervene, and when we began uncovering what the data on domestic violence in these cities, it was just staggering what we could or could not find in terms of. And then we brought in a judge from Superior Court judge from Essex, from down in Mass. What was his name? Where we were teaching them about. What's it called when they issue a restraining order?
Oh, restraining orders. Yeah.
And our Russian translators were saying, Charlie, we don't have a word for restraining order. Like what? Yeah. How can we explain this? But so we were doing these domestic violence programs, and we would get different groups. In fact, in Odessa, we had a group of nuns, we had groups of, weighing in, and they said that, we've never been asked we've never been asked to weigh in on this issue of domestic violence, but it's rampant, even though our police departments and so forth think it's, we know how to treat our women. It's under control. You guys don't need to tell us any domestic violence. And when we came to look at the statistics of deaths in domestic violence situations, for instance, in Petrozavodsk, if the woman didn't die at the time of the incident, if she died a day later, she didn't get recorded as a statistic.
Yeah.
Wow. So we were trying to uncover, so like how many.
But the Russians weren't that open to this kind of policing, as well.
No, it was, especially when we started in Tbilisi, and Georgian men say they know how to take care of their women and don't be telling us. And we started these women support groups, which opened up a chapter of that to this day is sort of, sort of legendary. But so the law enforcement programs, we began. We partnered with the criminal justice school in MS at Michigan State University.
Okay.
And the criminal justice school at South Carolina, at the University of South Carolina. And we began bringing over these groups of criminal justice students to the training academies, like in Lviv and Volgograd, and where they were training young police officers, and those partnerships just exploded. I mean, we were, and we got funding. We were placing computers in these police departments that they'd never had before.
Right.
So they had people that were capable of using it for data collection and so forth. And these the partnerships with MS, with the Michigan State, the head of the social sciences department out there, this guy Phil Smith, eventually became a director at Project Harmony and opened gobs of money and doors and stuff for us. But if our focus,
this was a big focus of your programs then, these criminal justice.
Well, it became, and it led to a connection with a State Department organization called INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement.
Okay.
Agency. I mean, and they have been a funder for the last 20 years of big money. And we took over a program that DOJ, the Department of Justice, had tried to implement through this how did that work? Anyways, DOJ couldn't implement this program called legal socialization. In other words, the looking at laws and trying to sort of interpret them. And when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the typical chain of command for law enforcement, disintegrated as well, and no longer could you enforce a juvenile justice through firing or working, threatening parents at work to control their children. But everything came down to sort of a free for all, and INL is responsible for the law enforcement attaches in all the embassies.
Okay.
And we began placing officers that had participated in our first program. We began placing them as in law enforcement attaches in embassies. They became Eddie Denmark, who's the police chief in Harvard, Mass.
Yeah.
Eddie Denmark is just this, he's been through a couple of Harvard programs in leadership and became just this exceptional trainer. Anyways, there's we've been at this for 36 years, or more than 36 years. So
right.
My ability to sort of categorize a lot of the programmatic sort of migration is, beyond your.
Yeah, no, the level of detail is beyond it. But to me, what's really interesting is this law enforcement connection that you established. I mean, I just can't believe that most people would understand that there was a period of time where police from small towns in New England and throughout the country were interacting with their colleagues in Russia and in the other independent states. It's not a well-known story, let's say.
Well, one of your questions is to sort of...
It has to go to let me ask you this. What long-term impact do you think that kind of program has had?
Well, that's so difficult to answer in a way because, when we first encountered the Soviet Union, it was really years of love affair. I began just writing down some quick thoughts about Russian culture that, we didn't know a lot about. We didn't know a lot about Russian history and Russian culture, and even some of our earliest participants from the schools in the school exchange program hadn't even taken World War II history.
Right.
They didn't know what side the Russians were on. It was hard for some of them to believe that the Russians and the Americans were fighting on the same side in the Second World War. And, just this sort of cultural, I just began sort of stream of consciousness, when we began being placed in Soviet homes.
Yeah.
And, when we first went there were these hard currency shops.
Right. I remember them.
The Berioshka, what were they called? Berioshka.
Yeah.
The black market. We told the kids, do not be exchanging rubles on the black market.
Right.
The black market exchanges, all the things that come back with from their host family. No shaking hand.
Rabbit hats. Right. Yeah.
Shake hands over the threshold.
Right.
No whistling inside the house.
Uh-huh.
It means you're going to lose all your money.
Yeah.
No going outside with wet hair. American teenagers would just, and the Russian mothers were making them stick their heads in the oven to dry their hair. Okay. And the kids would go out on the street, and if the kids had a jacket or something or a long coat that the hem was showing, or the women on the street would just come up to them and tap them and say, fix your coat.
Right.
and if the kids would walk around with their shoes untied,
Yeah.
the women would tap and say, tie your shoes.
Right.
And the difference between public spaces and private spaces, apartments and the corridors right outside apartments, was just like the kids would go up into these apartment buildings, with trash chutes and people peeing in the next to the elevators, and they'd walk into these apartments that were like tapachki, slippers, shoes off, rugs on the wall, everything, clean so and the standing in lines, our kids would say, well, what's everybody standing in line for? What, what's that all about? And, they said, well, they're standing in line for cheese and clothes, shoes and, the etiquette on trains, we took a lot of train trips and these coupes, I'm sure and the etiquette that sort of exists around, the bathrooms, and no flushing the toilets, in the stations, and
Right.
and the toilets that just dump, out onto the railroad tracks,
Railroad bed, yeah.
and then, when the kids encountered, and even I, like I think it was Georgia, one of the first apartments, we see this portrait of Stalin, over the piano.
Right.
And, the kids, some of the kids was asking, who's that? Who's that?
Yeah.
And the host would say, well, that's Stalin. And as an adult, I was pretty familiar that Stalin was not a hero in my
Right.
But here he is still hanging, on the wall of these apartments. So this sort of dichotomy of, is Stalin, a despot or a hero? I mean, still, and then encountering, the whole Banya Dacha sort of thing, especially in Karelia, the kids were being taken to these banyas and these little dachas, and this was like sacred territory, for most Russians, and then the police banyas and the railroad worker banyas, and oh my God, these things were like, and I'm just looking. Every school had a museum on the Great Patriotic War. Remnants, helmets with bullet holes and pieces of shrapnel and torn flags, and you got a tour of those museums whether you wanted it or not.
Yeah.
And those tours were not short.
Right.
Tours, and they were everywhere, everywhere. And so there is and I can remember, looking up at some of these balconies on these sort of Stalin type apartments, and seeing people, bathing in ice, in ice cold water, and the babies, we went into this one hospital, and these newborn babies were wrapped in these swaddling and stacked on a gurney like cordwood, just stacked up in a pyramid, with their heads and their little feet covered up, and
Yeah.
they being doled out to the mothers, as packages, and I mean, just on and on, these images that were so foreign to the kids and to us, but we saw them mostly as just sort of like, well, like in Leningrad, there's the Museum of Curiosities.
Right. Right.
You've been
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
but so there was this, and then Russian life is just embedded with music and dance, and these major plazas, of I don't know if they've ever been to Volgograd, and the Mamayev Kurgan statue, that's cut. I don't know. It's like 10 stories high, and
I've seen pictures of it. I've not been there. Yeah.
the Pool of Tears, and where the mothers of, and the scenes of the Battle of Volgograd or South Stalingrad, and
Yeah.
and and then there's after a few years and after different programs, you discover part of the underbelly of Russian culture.
Uh-huh.
And some of that, of course, underbelly became obvious to me and to our staff as adults. For instance, the domestic violence issue,
Yeah.
is serious. We had a whole series of law enforcement programs that focused on prisons. We were taking from Massachusetts, Gardner medium security, Sterling, high maximum security prisoners, Cook County prison, and we would be visiting prisons, female prisons, male prisons, across Russia and Ukraine, and seeing the tattooed knuckles, and with prisoner, and the work programs, and when we got into this disabled children's program in Karelia,
Yeah.
we encountered women who hadn't seen basically the light of day for 20 years, with disabled children that they were carrying around on their backs, and had never been asked to come to a meeting where there might be some services of some kind, offered,
Yeah.
and we established a group of taxi drivers in Petrozavodsk who agreed to transport women and their disabled children to the arena, to the market. In order to get there, prior to that, they had to carry them onto a tram, on their backs, and people just shunned them, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then the orphanages that we began working with, I mean, oh my God. I mean, it was like another sort of part of the underbelly, of, adoption and fostering kids is not a part of Russian culture. And these orphanages were 18-year-olds were taking care of 2-year-olds, and those 18-year-olds had been there most of their life, and then, we got into the gulags, when we established an office in Tomsk and Irkutsk and out into the Ulan-Ude, out into that area. And we took a group of performing teenagers up the Ob River one summer. And Dan, if I can't even begin to tell you the villages that we encountered on that trip, that the Ob freezes over, so they're not accessible a lot of the year.
Right.
Some of the old believer villages, some of the villages were totally Polish, or I think one of them was actually, Stalin had exiled these groups of people to these Siberian places, and we were performing. We'd go to these villages and just this boat we were on, would just sort of run it into the sandbar and get off, and we had fiddle players and clogging kids that we taught clogging to and so forth. And we encountered one village where the Ob had opened up a mass grave where there were like 1,000 bodies in this grave. And
Wow.
and they, they were frozen and had begun to sort of float down the Ob and so forth. And so, after that trip, that trip was like, going back 100 years or 200 years into to Soviet life. The old believer villages that we encountered were they were frozen in time,
Frozen in time. Yeah. When was this, in the early 90s as well?
Yeah, this was, gosh, I'm not good on the dates, but but the follow-up to that was that my son, in his senior year in college,
Yeah.
was looking for a thesis project.
Yeah.
And in some of our first trips to Karelia, we encountered some of the remnants of the migration of American Finns and Canadian Finns to the Soviet Union in the 1930s.
Okay. Wow.
I don't know if you remember that whole piece of history, but there were about 10 to 15,000, they figure, that were recruited by Russian recruiters that came over to the work halls of America, particularly to the Finnish settlements in Upper Michigan and different places, and recruited people with skills, carpenters, electricians, miners, so forth. And we encountered a couple in Petrozavodsk in probably 1989. A couple named Elmer and Miriam and Elmer Nosiainen, a Finnish name, and their parents had been convinced to migrate back to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And Elmer was, I think, 14 at the time. Miriam's family was also recruited, and I think she was 12 or something. And it turns out Elmer, he had to give up his American passport, when so forth. And when he was about, 24 or something, he went to the American embassy in Moscow to retrieve his American passport and was arrested there. He spent 16 years in a gulag. 16 years in a gulag. And Miriam, during those years, was running from with her mother from all over in northern Karelia and the White Sea area and Arkhangelsk. But Dave decided he would, because when we went to Petrozavodsk and they found out we were an American and their families had migrated from America, they contacted us and said, because they actually spoke English in Russian, and said, could you, we'd like talk with you, and
Uh-huh.
and and Miriam could bake a pretty good apple pie at the time.
Uh-huh.
And so my son became attached to this couple, and I wrote his thesis on this migration and Elmer's stories of his 16 years in the Gulag.
Yeah. Wow.
And beyond that, so Dave began recruiting kids for summer trips to explore Gulag survivors and record their stories, you know.
Wow. Wow.
And went out to the area in Irkutsk and Tomsk, in that area where these villages were established and so forth, and began recording stories of some of these fairly elderly women, actually, where they were the ones that survived, but spent a lot of their life running through the woods to do it. And he had a group of teenage students from he became after his graduation from Stanford and Harvard Ed School, became a teacher at Lincoln Sudbury High School.
Oh, okay.
And he would take students with him as videographers and recorders and so forth, and began collecting these stories. So another piece of the underbelly of Russian culture that we began becoming familiar with was this whole the Gulag. And of course, Solzhenitsyn was a resident just south of us here for many years.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
In Chester, Vermont. And also Elke Schumann. You know Elke Schumann. Elke Schumann was the daughter of John Scott. John Scott wrote a book called Beyond the Urals. His experience in the 1930s living in Magnitogorsk. Magnitogorsk is the iron steel mills of Soviet times, and Elke Schumann became a legend here in Vermont as the wife of Peter Schumann, who formed the Bread and Puppet Theater, which is
right. I remember them. Yeah.
And so we began a very close relationship with Elke Schumann because she had relatives in Latvia, and we would help her go visit them and so forth. And the stories of her childhood as the daughter of John Scott, who was wrote that book, which is, I don't know if you've ever read that thing.
I have not read that book. I think I've heard of it, but I have not read it. No. Yeah.
Anyways, so there was this growing, our initial sort of euphoria and sort of look at Soviet culture and Soviet society from these classical direct school exchanges, these special focus programs in ecology and folk music, and God, we paired up with a group of folk singers from Tomsk that was amazing, and then we began to discover, part of Russian society was a little bit of the underbelly, and almost every encounter, whether it was with the coat women at the Hermitage Museum, who would, through our translators would they would tell us about, after the war, there weren't any men left.
Yeah.
these women in these juice and these little cafeterias, where you could get a glass of juice and you'd hand the glass back to the woman, and she'd put it in the cold water, and the next and hand it to the next person. They would start telling us these stories about, I don't know, kids would ask, why are all the women and why are all the dentists women?
Yeah.
Or and these women would just look at them and say, it was like 10-1 after the war. There was nobody left, no men left, for these professions. And these women, I don't know if you've ever encountered them, in the parks with these brooms made out of twigs.
Oh yeah, sure.
These legions of women just cleaning and with equipment, made from little saplings and
Right.
bundles of twigs, and our kids would look and just say, what are they doing? How can they sweep with those twigs? And so, anyways, there's just this. When you ask about, in the final, I don't know if it's the final analysis, but do you think we did any good there, or do you think we made any headway in open society? We became very involved with the Soros Foundation. In recent years, we had some big grants from Microsoft, from Intel. We established about 300 internet classrooms across Russia. We had a grant called the Internet Access and Training Programs.
Right.
We would go into libraries and universities and renovate a room, put probably 12 computers, train journalists basically how to operate these computers, how to access the internet, how to build. And then when Intel came to us and said, "Can you take groups of teachers and do the same? Teach them how to build curriculums based on real information, and so forth." We began working with Microsoft. Gave us money to work with the blind and deaf communities in Russia. So we had programs from Vladivostok to Oriol to Tumen to Yakutsk. And our life took us to, for instance, in Armenia, we built internet classrooms in 150 secondary schools.
Yeah.
We built 2 mobile vehicles that had 3 workstations, a satellite dish, and we would go to these remote villages and set up for 2 weeks at a time and access the internet off of a satellite that we got access through to the U.S. Army, or somebody gave us access to these things, and of course we got embedded in Armenian culture, which if you've been to Watertown or other places, you'll know that some Armenian food is quite good. And then our presence in Moscow, for instance, I can't tell you how many ambassadors and 3-year foreign service crews we've outlived. And one of the people I'd like to put you on to is Paul Smith, who in our early days was the general counsel in St. Petersburg, and went on to be the DCM in Moscow. And Paul Smith, along with Senator Leahy, we were squiring these people around Karelia and different places as
Right.
Showing them programs and so forth. And so we became very embedded in the embassies, and St. Pete was a consulate.
Right.
And in fact, for years, we've run the American Corners program out of the Moscow embassy, which is the American culture program that deals with Muskie fellowships and brings in all kinds of professors and lecturers to the Soviet to Russia, and because we were a constant there, and as the ambassadors and staff at the embassy changed every 3 years, they just say, well, go talk to Project Harmony if you want to find out what's happening, and
Right.
And just keep giving them.
How big was your office there?
Oh God, 1 week. Probably at its height, it was probably maybe 25 people.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And
We had a retreat in Tbilisi 2 years ago, and probably had I don't know, 2/3 of our staff there, and we had 50 people there, from all our offices,
uh-huh.
but Moscow was, we had, when Yeltsin was jumping on the tanks and all this stuff, our office there was run by this guy, Paul Podolsky, and Paul, former bicycle courier from Washington, D.C.,
Okay.
and decided he would do the same in Moscow. So when things were just going crazy there, he was riding his bike, like, he said, Charlie, I can't tell you how many times I should have been killed in that city, and
Right.
during Yeltsin's crazy time, and the confrontations and tanks and stuff, he was there, and he's another person who got involved in, when he came back to the States. Well, he married a woman from Siberia, from, I forget, from Sverdlovsk or Novakuz or somewhere. Went to work for a hedge fund as the sort of Russian contact there, and
Uh-huh.
but is so when the Soviet Union collapsed and the businesses started to appear,
Right.
we were very, the first McDonald's, was a quick walk from our office in Moscow, on the what was that street called? The
Tverskaya.
yeah,
On Tverskaya?
yeah,
Yeah.
and and the shawarma stands and stuff,
Right.
and so and Dave Kelley, our third director, Dave Kelley, started a business in when the he started a T-shirt printing business
Uh-huh.
when the duty-free shops were still in existence, and the so forth, and he and Scott European, that company, Scott European, and what was the guy's name? Anyways, Kelly lost probably $100,000 in this, but he thought he could hire a manager,
Yeah.
and managed this business from Vermont, from the States. And I was with him on one occasion when he went to Moscow to check in on the business, and we walked into the office that we were renting, and the manager and he had 2 or 3 employees had bought a secondhand Volvo and gone to Vienna or somewhere like that. They bought all the sneakers and Austrian beer that they could fit in this car, and they brought it back and they put it in the bedroom of this office. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we came to check on this T-shirt printing business, which unfortunately was a cash business, Dave happened to sort of open the door to this bedroom. I happened to be there at the time, and he just said, "What the hell is this?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, we're getting into selling sneakers and beer, and so forth." Well, Kelley had this a temper, and I remember him slamming the glass coffee table in this office and smashing this thing to smithereens.
Whoa.
And telling these guys to just get the hell out, and I said, "Dave," I said, "Charlie, you can't trust anybody. You can't, I said, "Dave, you can't manage a cash business from the state if you think everyone's going to, like hand over all the money when they're going to these duty-free shops, and collecting your T-shirt money, I mean,
right.
And one of his ways of trying to, when he hired people, this was what he did. He would interview someone in the kitchen of this office apartment, and he would put a package of cigarettes on the table, open. And, everybody at the time smoked, and so forth. And then he would excuse himself to go to the bathroom. He says, "Just a minute, I'll be right back." And when he came back, if they'd stolen some cigarettes out of his cigarette, he knew that they weren't going to be a good employee. And I said, "Dave, so how long did it?" He says, "Everybody stole them." He says, I had to give up that system of truthfulness, and somehow in those days there was no banking system. So when I went to the Soviet Union, I would carry anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 in cash in my pants or inside my Parker lining or somewhere in my coat, and when Dave wanted to send money back to the States, he would tell me, "So Charlie, go into the bedroom and if you look under the mattress and see if you can find something." And he wouldn't tell me. He said, "And whatever you find, just take it back with you." So I'd go in and I'd look under the mattress, and somehow he'd converted cash to traveler's checks. In those days, Stockman's from Helsinki had opened some stores in Stockman's. Stockman's was the place to buy Ben and Jerry's and buy foods. Anyways, carrying money to the Soviet Union was like, and we wouldn't ask any of our female staff to do it, but we would ask a lot of our male staff to stuff their coats, with
Yeah.
money in it.
Yeah.
Of course, There was no X-ray machines or anything at that time, and often I remember our Ukrainian staff going from Russia to Ukraine. I would say, Anya, what are you doing? And she said, well, I need an old newspaper here. And I said, so, and I said, well, why? She said, well, just don't ask me what I'm doing, and she would put rubles or dollars in this newspaper and slide it to some, customs official, and to let us through the gates. And oh my God, the customs, when we went with performing groups, we took performing groups, we took a rock band there, and we took all the amplifiers and currency converters, and we had these trunks, I made like 3 or 4 of these big rolling trunks of stuff, and when they got to the airports, they got put into the baggage, and I had to go and claim them, and to claim them, at the what was it, the Tamozniki, they wanted something in return, before they'd release them, and so whenever I did that, I would always pack, some baseball hats and some, stuff in with the musical equipment, and I'd unlock these chests, and I'd just start handing it out.
Counting out stuff, yeah.
And usually they were women, and they'd say fine, but if they were men, they'd say no, we want more than that, basic. And I'd say, well, you're not getting any of this equipment, we need this. One summer we took a performing group from a big performing high school in Tennessee, was it? And we were doing a Broadway musical, a part of a Broadway musical. God, I can't even remember. And, we had to hire basically a big bus, and we were going in that sort of golden circle there from Nizhny Novgorod to I forget the various things, but it got so, we had to bribe so many people, and I began riding in the dump truck that was carrying the scenery, because the dump truck drivers were selling off the scenery, for this play that we were putting on, and so, Russian culture is stealing was just a way of life, and they didn't call it stealing; they called it, sort of appropriating goods for their personal dacha use,
Right.
But in amongst all this, Paul Richardson, which who was
the editor. I knew him at one point. I wrote some articles for his publication.
Yeah, that's right.
Back in the day.
He represented initially Alpha Graphics. Alpha Graphics was, I think, a Canadian firm, or at least to start with over there. But Paul Richardson, Dave Kelley, and myself, and 3 Russians set up a business called Business for Russia. And this is just after, I think, the breakup. And you remember the commercial center in Moscow, the Mezh, I think it was called.
Yeah, sure. Arnold, the Hammer Center. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, somehow these 3 Russians that I don't know who got a hold of them, or this company called Berioshka, I think it was called. It was Birch Tree Associates, and these three Russian guys somehow had access to all these apartments. They knew the owners and so forth. So we began leasing. We became a company that was leasing apartments to incoming businesses.
Oh, really?
Oh my God. There were people coming in, and these Russian guys eventually came over to Vermont, and we gave them the basement of our office, we renovated it, or they renovated it. We kept this rental business going for, not too long. And then they wanted to establish a flower business.
Flowers as in plants?
Delivering flowers on, Russian holidays.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Russian immigrants to America, sending flowers to the Soviet Union, wanting flowers to be delivered to their
okay.
opening of school day,
Right.
all these,
Yeah.
and these three Russian guys, they were endless with ideas, and we just said, well, yeah, sure, let's go. We were making money. We were, it was split, 6 or 8 ways.
Right.
But, that didn't last too long, because people leasing these apartments decided that, they could lease them directly and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But it was just a completely wild time.
Yeah.
And we, Paul Richardson, and Alpha Graphics, and David Kelley and his T-shirt business. Every time he mentions that, he says, "Charlie, remember, I lost $100,000. You don't want to laugh at me. You don't want to laugh." And he gave all the equipment to an American guy who had married a Russian woman and wanted to stay there, and I forget how it all transpired, but
he literally lost 100,000.
Yeah, and he had convinced Bob Cratley, who was head of the business called Scott European.
Okay.
And somehow they were sending medical equipment to some parts of Russia, and somehow it was being paid for by coal that Cratley somehow could sell somewhere in Europe. I forget exactly how this all worked, but if you look up in early businesses, Scott European and Bob Cratley is right in there.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me that a number of people who were involved in citizen diplomacy, then in the early days at the break of the Soviet Union, it got involved in businesses. And I think my sense of that is that Russians like to do business with people they know. So who did they know? They knew the citizen diplomat people. And so, that was a pattern, I guess. I've seen that,
Yeah, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the business scene, although it was exploding around us, because some of our staff got sort of hired off into, in fact, one of them, Sam Vanderlip, is married to a woman who works in the Dutch embassy in Moscow, and he's been there for years, and he works with a consulting group there in Moscow.
Yeah.
And Paul Hinshaw, I don't know if you ever encountered him. He was the representative from the American Chamber of Commerce who spent quite a few years after working for us, working for the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow.
Okay.
Kelley and Richardson wrote the business guide for Moscow. Paul Richardson did all these upgrades to these maps of all these Soviet cities, Russian cities, and hired people to go out and redraw the proper roads and geographic features and so forth. And but I stayed pretty much in the nonprofit sector. Some of our staff got hired off by the Eurasia Foundation. Some were working for the Soros Foundation. Soros became a pretty big player in Russia, but as we migrated to the Ukraine and to the Baltics and especially to the Caucasus and so forth, there was no lack of work in the nonprofit sector, and we became a really trusted partner in the embassies, because we somehow survived different sort of generations of those embassies and became familiar with the various departments, the PAS, the public, I forget what all the different parts of those embassies are, but and in some cases, became like with Paul Smith, and he's sends me messages. His wife's Ukrainian, so he sends me a lot more messages these days than and right now, just today, I have a friend in Petrozavodsk. He's marching with a group of, he's 22 years old. He's marching with a group of friends to the Finnish border, and he says, we're out of here. We're out of here.
Wow.
We have a Ukrainian staff member who got to Poland with his wife and two young sons, and we figured out a way to send him money that he's distributing to the Ukrainians that are sort of flooding into Poland, and I wired him $2,800 today to and people are just like, where can I send you money, and how can we get it there with some assurance that it'll land in the proper places, and my travels in, we used to have an office in Baku, Baku, Yerevan, and Tbilisi, and there's a triumph that we were, Yerevan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan don't see eye to eye, and we were like trying to balance programs and mix students from three countries and having these horrendous discussions, and the teachers from Abkhazia, the province in Georgia that is sort of partially occupied by Russia. You know, when we were there a couple of years ago, you know, the Russians nearly took over Georgia in 2008.
Yeah.
And the world never hardly knew about it, you know, thing. And so they're cheering for Ukraine right now, big time. You know? And it's there's so many moving parts to working in that part of the world that I can't always separate in my own mind, you know, between Karelia and Tbilisi, you know,
Right.
there's
Right.
and having lived a year in Finland, you know, I have and finishing Finland and Karelia, you know, used to be one
Right.
one place. So their folklore and their music and their language, you know, there's a whole to do of Karelian language in Petrozavodsk, you know, with schools that specialize in that. And so,
well, you've had an amazing experience and life and achievements, you know, starting from the three of you getting together to try to do something. I mean,
yeah, well, it's, you know, Olin Robeson's suggestion that it might be a marathon rather than if we wanted to work in that part of the world,
right.
That you know, it's turned into an ultra marathon, you know, where you're running not 26 miles but 126 miles.
Yeah, right.
And
no end in sight.
and you're running at night, you know. And with a little headlamp on, and that headlamp doesn't shed much light on the whole situation. Right. And you know, I have friends who don't know a lot about, you know, that part of the world. Just as a child, you know, I just yesterday I just felt, you know, when Putin suggested nuclear weapons was on the table, that my life just flashed before me. You know, he said, you know, and so in 1985, when the Cold War was child's play, you know, and the sort of constipation of our diplomatic efforts, frankly, were spectacular when Reagan and Gorbachev, you know, sort of decided, you know, that the jig was up and we should probably be doing things in a different way. And of course, Gorbachev didn't make it more than about 6 years, and there was Yeltsin, who thought he wasn't doing enough. You know, so you know, I think back to the times I lined up in Red Square at Lenin's tomb. With school groups. And those the Soviet army guards, you know, would, you know, if you put your hands in your pocket or you had to check your pocketbooks, you couldn't carry anything in those lines. I mean, and it was like, and you got in there and walked by this embalmed creature, and you couldn't speak, you know. I mean, it was, I don't know if you ever.
Yeah, I went through there. Yeah, I did it. Yep.
And then John Reed's name is on the wall behind there. You know?
Right.
I mean, it's and so I don't know. You know, looking back on it all it's really hard to and given the current status of things, it's really hard to sort of, geez, you know, that was a great run, and
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
a great culture to be involved with, and I mean, I've met so many people who have Russian and Belarusian. I mean, we were hosting a group from Minsk about 3 years ago. I was, you know, they were sleeping in my house.
Yeah.
You know, we had a
Yeah.
program there, and but when we took our first group there in 1985, the Soviet soldiers were tearing the cameras out of our students' hands and taking the film, ripping the film out of the cameras, you know, and
Right.
taking the cameras back to our kids, you know, saying, you know,
Yeah.
no pictures, you know.
Yeah. Pictures. Yeah.
So, yet, you know, when we went to the Pioneer Palace in Minsk and performed and their groups performed, you know, and the parents were yelling and screaming, and we were having these parties after the performance, and you know, I mean, you know, when the world was like, you
Yeah.
know, it
Yeah.
was, and so, you know, there's a part of me that's just emotionally a wreck
Yeah. Yeah.
at
Yeah.
the moment.